Hello, everyone. So glad to be here. Welcome to, there we go. I think I've got it going. Welcome to our live talk today. As part of, we are continuing the Eating for Mental Wellness series, which each week focuses on a new therapeutic diet that targets different pathways, but have been shown to be effective at improving mood and overall health. So before I launch into everything, I want to introduce myself. Hello. And for the people that are starting to log on, hi, so glad that you're here. So my name is Kimsey Bergman. I'm an integrative nutritionist in my online nutrition and wellness practice called Progressive Health and Wellness, where I work with ambitious men and women who are struggling with their mental health or performance by taking a root-caused body-mind approach to optimize physical and mental health. So often in these lives, I feel like almost everyone I talk about, we start with a therapeutic diet. We start with a therapeutic diet. We start with a therapeutic diet. But I take that back. I do go into detail a lot of the time. You've probably noticed some tenets are very similar. A lot of them overlap. But diet is so unique to the person and is highly personalizable. And so for that reason, that's what inspired the idea for this series, is highlighting some of the different types of therapeutic diets that we will implement based on that person's overall health and what they're presenting with and their history and their symptoms and what the lab values show. And it's worth mentioning too, oftentimes we overlap some of these diets. So last week, I went into what I consider the OG of therapeutic diets, which is the paleo diet. And I started with that one because, as I just said, that one often serves as our foundation. So what I mean by that is I will pull tenets of the paleo diet, like gluten-free, dairy-free, no processed foods, very little sugar, corn-free, soy-free. I pull tenets of that diet and roll them in. It's like I build upon that when implementing other forms of therapeutic diets. So today we're going to talk about the low FODMAP diet. This is one that I use very often if I suspect or if I know, because I'm going to test, that somebody has SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So I'll elaborate a little bit more on that today, a little bit about what SIBO is. The reason I emphasize a little is because I've gone into depth about SIBO, done entire live talks on SIBO and other times. So if you suspect that you have SIBO, if you listen to this and you're like, oh my God, I think that might be me, go to my private Facebook group, Holistic Solutions for Mental Health and Wellness. Search in that group, SIBO, and all those talks, lots of information will come up on that. So, but where I was going with that is, even if I'm implementing the low FODMAP diet for a client, I'm still going to pull some of the tenets of the paleo diet into that. So that's why we started there. And that also, again, really speaks to the level of bioindividuality that we strive to achieve with each person that we work with. So a few people wanted to be notified when I went live today. So I am going to do that right now. Last week it didn't let me do this either. That's so frustrating. Okay, well, I'm going to try it and see if it'll let me. And if not, then I'll just have to do it on the replay again. Okay, so let's start with, why would somebody want to follow the low FODMAP diet? And what conditions does it help? So the low FODMAP diet, low FODMAP is an acronym. It stands for fermentable oligodisaccharides and polyols. So basically highly fermentable starches that are found in a lot of different types of food. And those starches, when there's an imbalance in the gut microbiome, particularly when there's an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestines, which is a condition known as small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. These bacteria will feed on that food, will feed on those starches. When they do that, they produce hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide gases, to some degree methane. Quick caveat there, I used to SIBO used to be differentiated into hydrogen dominant or methane dominant. Hydrogen tends to cause diarrhea. Methane tends to cause constipation. You can have both. Used to be differentiated. They're now different. They're considered different. So there's SIBO, which is an overgrowth of bacteria and is associated with diarrhea and has the hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide dominance. And there's IMO, intestinal methanogen overgrowth, which can be an overgrowth of bacteria, but also an organism called archaea, and that produces an excess of methane. And the low FODMAP diet has not shown to be effective for IMO, for methanogen overgrowth. So now I use the low FODMAP diet if I know that somebody has SIBO. They have high levels of hydrogen. They're presenting with diarrhea or alternations, mixed constipation and diarrhea, but their lab testing confirms that they have SIBO. There are other instances where it can be therapeutic. So evidence has shown that for GI autoimmunity, like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or celiac, low FODMAP can be beneficial. I will generally do a different nutrition approach for those conditions, though, unless I know that SIBO is driving it. So ultimately, this boils down to SIBO. Now, SIBO also accounts for anywhere between 35 to 50% of all irritable bowel syndrome cases. So it's very common. And then let's talk about how SIBO impacts mental health and performance, and why then the low FODMAP diet would be effective for improving mood and digestive health. So SIBO, this overgrowth of bacteria, will impact the health of the brain and therefore our mood in a number of ways. But some of the bigger ways are it'll create nutrient deficiencies. So these bugs will eat our nutrients and produce waste products. So we see it associated with low B vitamins, especially B12 and folate, B6. We see it associated with low iron. It can create other mineral deficiencies. And then, not to mention, because of how SIBO affects hydrochloric acid levels or bile acid release or pancreatic enzyme release, we can also see deficiencies in macronutrients like fatty acids. Somebody's not absorbing their fat appropriately, or even lower protein because of the lower hydrochloric acid levels in the stomach. So nutrient deficiencies are big. Number 2 is inflammation. So I mentioned they eat our nutrients and produce waste products. Those waste products, hydrogen sulfide gas being main big ones, but also these bacteria will produce what are called lipopolysaccharides, or LPS. Another name for lipopolysaccharide is endotoxin. So these lipopolysaccharides, not only do they degrade the intestinal lining and contribute to leaky gut syndrome, but they also cross through the intestinal barrier and trigger inflammation in the brain and body. This mechanism is so well known, in fact, that when researchers are studying the inflammatory response in vivo, so in a petri dish, they will actually use lipopolysaccharides to initiate the inflammatory response. So we know the impact that lipopolysaccharides have on inflammation. So that's just one way. But then we know, as that intestinal lining is degraded, that also opens us up for further insults from food and other toxins that we're eating, pathogens, bacteria, etc. And then the third way that SIBO can massively influence mental health is through disrupting the synthesis of neurotransmitters. So part of this happens in the gut. Many of you have probably heard that 95% of our serotonin is made in the digestive tract. The microbes can also synthesize norepinephrine and dopamine and GABA and some like major neurochemicals that directly influence our mood. Not to mention the inflammation that occurs in the brain will also disrupt neuronal signaling and the proper synthesis of these really important neurochemicals. So from there, we can get into a lot more nuanced conversation about how SIBO can influence mental health and brain health. But again, for that, I'm going to divert to the other talks I've already given. But it is safe to, one other one that's really important is histamine. I can't let that one go. The imbalance of bacteria in the small intestines can definitely contribute to histamine intolerance, because these bacteria will ferment these different starches, and proteins in the food that we eat, and convert histidine in the food that we're eating into histamine. Not to mention they can trigger the mast cells that line the intestinal tract. That also produces histamine. There's a number of ways it interferes with liver detoxification, gallbladder function. There's a number of ways that this can lead to histamine intolerance. And histamine is a very potent neurostimulator. So histamine intolerance is associated with anxiety and panic attacks for sure, brain fog for sure, fatigue. And then some people can also present with depression and ADD, ADHD type symptoms. But I mostly see anxiety and the brain fog. Okay, so talking about the low FODMAP diet, the intention of the low FODMAP diet is to remove those fermentable starches that are continuing to feed the bacteria, because like any organism on the planet, that population, the bacterial population, will only grow as fast as its food supply. So the more food that it has, the faster the population overgrows. If we restrict that food, it stops its growth. So that's the intention of the low FODMAP diet, is to restrict the food that's feeding the bacteria, and specifically figure out which type of those fermentable starches is your trigger. So most of the time, it's not all of the fermentable starches. There's usually one or two. Like some people will be particularly reactive to polyols or fructose or fructans. And so that's what we're ultimately trying to figure out. So the low FODMAP diet, it can be very effective for controlling the symptoms of SIBO. With that said, it's meant to be truly an elimination diet, which I'll elaborate on in just a minute. But also, it's not going to fix the SIBO on its own. So I've never seen that. The literature doesn't suggest that low FODMAP will cure SIBO. It's a method that can be employed, stop the symptoms or reduce the symptoms, stop the bleeding. And then we need to employ antimicrobials, in some cases antibiotics, to really eradicate the bacteria and bring them back down to normal levels. And then in our process, we also make sure to address what are the different underlying factors that allowed the SIBO to manifest in the first place. Was it food poisoning? Could there be poor liver, gallbladder function? Could there be estrogen dominance? Could there be frequent medication, antibiotic, and acid usage? So we get to figure out what allowed the SIBO to manifest in the first place, and then also clean up the residual effects that the SIBO has had on the rest of the body, like the nutrient deficiencies and the maldigestion and the inflammation. So going back to implementing the low FODMAP diet. So the low FODMAP diet is really intended to be an elimination diet. What that means is it's followed in its entirety for anywhere between 2 to 6 weeks. After that time frame, I usually do it for about 3 to 4 weeks. If somebody is starting to show improvement, I'll typically do it for up to 4 weeks. And if they're not showing any changes by 3 weeks, I'll typically pause it, because that means that there might be something else that's continuing to drive the symptoms. It's also worth mentioning that, because I mentioned that I overlap a lot of these different therapeutic diets. So when looking at the low FODMAP diet, you'll see some of the other trigger foods would still be allowed. So like certain forms of dairy, for example, or certain forms of gluten or soy. Because these are notorious triggers of symptoms, but especially mental health and performance. So like the impact that gluten and dairy have on the brain and brain inflammation and the formation of gluteo and casomorphins, which not only makes them physiologically addicting, but also, again, impacts our neuronal signaling. I pull everyone off of those foods. So I will overlap that. We'll do low FODMAP with being gluten-free, dairy-free, soy, corn, sugar, processed foods. It's kind of like snack foods that you'll find in Whole Foods or any grocery store for that matter. Just because it's organic, even if the ingredients aren't that great, it doesn't mean it's healthy because it's organic. So same thing here. Even if something is low FODMAP doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be, fit into an optimal therapeutic diet. So going back to implementing, say 4 weeks, I have somebody strictly remove all of those FODMAPs, the fermentable. So like fermented foods, kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, oligosaccharides, disaccharides, and polyols. These are in a wide variety of foods. So broccoli, avocado, cauliflower, almonds, lots of different healthy foods. It's also some foods are all foods, I'll say, are dose dependent, which means if you eat a small enough or certain quantity of XYZ food, like asparagus, I'll come back to that. If you eat a small enough quantity of that food, it can be considered low FODMAP. But if you eat too much of it, then it can be high FODMAP. So take asparagus, for example. Asparagus is a notoriously high FODMAP food. 1 spear of asparagus is considered high FODMAP. So if you were to eat half a spear, you might be okay. But 1 spear is considered high FODMAP. So if you eat more than that, it's going to be high FODMAP. Broccoli, don't quote me on this, but I think broccoli is like a cup of broccoli. So less than a cup of broccoli is low FODMAP. More than a cup is high. So it's dose dependent, which some people like, because that does mean for some foods, you can have some of it, right? You can eat some of it. For other foods like the asparagus or like garlic or artichoke, even the smallest amount is going to be, who's going to eat half a spear of asparagus? So the smallest amount is going to be considered high FODMAP. Nonetheless, what is a game changer for anybody following the low FODMAP diet is using the app called Monash. So Monash, Monash University, they're based out of Australia. They did all of the research around the low FODMAP diet, SIBO, FODMAPs, how it fuels it. They spearheaded all of that. And they have a phenomenal app that I think it's like $5, one-time payment. And this app, it's a huge food database, and you can search the different foods, you can search products, and it will show you exactly that. Take broccoli again, it'll tell you which type of FODMAP it's high in. It will tell you the quantities. So when is it low? When is it medium? When is it high? This is invaluable, because that is one of the trickier things about the low FODMAP diet. I'm going to be real. For the first little while, you're going to be checking that app all the time, right? I provide my clients with a list that it's like green, yellow, red. Green is like you can eat almost limitless quantities of this food, and it's going to be considered low FODMAP. Yellow is measure it, kind of like broccoli, right? Measure it. It could be easy to exceed the amount, but if you stay within the limits, it's okay. And then red would be like the asparagus, where even the smallest amount is going to be high FODMAP. I provide my clients with that, but it's impossible to include every food that's out there. Plus, you need to check the serving sizes. So that's one of the hindrances, the challenges of low FODMAP, especially when you're first getting used to it. I did it myself one time experimentally, and I was like glued to that app until you start getting, because it's a short period of time. What I encourage is get some recipes that you can then repeat. Let's say you have maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 different recipes that you can eat for different meals, dinners, lunches, that's leftovers, breakfast, snacks. Like, get your repertoire down. That'll take a lot of the thinking out of it. That would be my biggest encouragement. So do some experimentation at the beginning, try different foods that you might like. If you don't normally eat Brazil nuts or macadamia nuts, like, go try those. Those are awesome nuts that are low FODMAP. Do some experimentation, try some things you wouldn't normally, but then ultimately work to get some recipes that you like. We provide our clients with menu plans, including 7-day menu plan, which is free to anybody that comments on this post requesting it. Just a PDF. I'll send it to you. It's yours to keep. And that will help immensely with implementing this. Okay, so next, after the trial period, so after the elimination phase, 2 to 6 weeks after the elimination phase, then we go through the process of reintroduction. So how we do that is each week is the easiest way to do it. I have my clients introduce one new category of food. So like fructose. Honestly, I have to consult the app. I have a handout, a document that I give my clients that gives examples of all of them, of different foods that they can introduce at each phase. But basically the way that it works is you'll introduce like fructose first, and then fructans, and then polyols, and you go through the list of the different ones, oligosaccharides, and it gives out the types of foods that you can do. And you introduce one new food every like 3 days and see if it causes symptoms, basically. So let's say you start with apples for fructose. So you do apples, and then maybe you do, I don't know, watermelon, something like that. 3 days later, if there's no symptoms, then I have my clients, they can eat that food. If there are symptoms, then you cut that food out again, wait for the symptoms to subside, and then move on to the next category. Do that in the same fashion until you've gotten through all the other categories, and then revisit that one to confirm. And if it causes symptoms again, that's your trigger, and you don't eat that category only, but the other ones that were non-triggers can come back in. From there, we will continue with that form of the diet. So let's say one goes through and they introduce all of those other foods, and it was only fructose that is a trigger. I will then have the person typically do a modified paleo diet. So as I was describing before, gluten-free, dairy-free, soy, corn, sugar, processed foods, grains are reduced, significantly reduced, and then continue with low fructose. So avoid fructose foods. And we'll stick with that. We'll stick with that diet for a few months while we continue to work on uncovering and addressing the underlying causes. So in this case, we know SIBO is part of it. So that's where we're going to start to come in with some antimicrobials, digestive enzymes, maybe some hydrochloric acid support, some like specific and targeted strains of probiotics. We will address the SIBO because ultimately that's the problem, right? And then after that, after we've gone through the gut focused protocol, and that's part of it too. So if somebody has mold toxicity, for example, or if they have nutrient deficiencies, if they have nervous system dysregulation, histamine intolerance, like that's when we're really fixing all of that. So we'll go through the gut focused protocol. We'll then move into more of the environmental personalization. Do we need to deal with mold? Do we need to deal with hormones? What do we need to deal with next? And then all the while we're keeping that therapeutic diet. So for some people, it might be 3 to 4 months. For others, it might be like, frankly, 9 to 12, depending on what they're showing. And then at that point, once they are feeling. They've noticed at least 80% improvement. That's my benchmark. And they are feeling consistently good. And they know if they have a setback or a flare up, they know what caused it, right? They eat off the plan, they go through a really stressful experience, whatever it might be. That is when we've got that strong baseline and we start introducing different foods back in. That process ultimately, and how fast that goes and where the person lands afterwards, ultimately depends on the person. How do they feel about reintroducing foods back in? How do they respond to it? What is their relationship with food? And what is their ultimate goal for their health? So what I mean by that, if I've had clients like meet their goals and they want to keep eating that way because it is so much easier to eat that way than it is to feel like crap. So they keep doing it. One thing that and then I've had other clients that they can't wait to bring certain foods back in. And so we go through that, we talk about where will that fit in a way that allows you to keep feeling your best. And that's where that connection, that deep connection with your body and with food becomes so important so that they essentially can become their own doctor and no longer need us. So last thing I want to say with that is on that reintroduction process, at the end of the whole process, I really rely on intuition for that. So what I mean by that is I'll talk to them and say, hey, like, we're at a great place to start reintroducing foods if you want to. How do you feel about that? And listen to their body. Is it a whole body? Yes, like I can't wait to bring these foods back in. If it's not, some people have kind of a fear of it and there's a hesitancy and they're like, I don't know if it's worth it. I feel nervous about doing it. I don't miss those foods really. They associate it with not feeling well. In which case I tell them, you don't have to. At the end of the day, do what serves you best and trust that there will probably come a time when it is a whole body yes, and it makes sense for them to introduce those foods at that time. Okay, everyone. So as I've mentioned, anybody listening to this, if you want a free 7-day low FODMAP menu plan, it comes with recipes, shopping lists, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, whole 9 yards. Comment below menu plan and I'll send it to you. I've also typed up an extensive blog on the low FODMAP diet, how it helps mood and mental performance, what SIBO is, all those things. And it's just simply linked in there. That menu plan is linked in the blog. So it's a 2-for-1. So let me know if you want that. Comment below and I'll send it to you. Lastly, actually 2 things. Next week is the autoimmune paleo diet. So that's where I'm going to talk about, it's like paleo, but it's further refined to for those that are struggling with autoimmunity. So if you want to attend that live or you want to be notified, also drop a comment, let me know, and I'll make sure to notify you as we're going live. And then lastly, if you're listening to this episode, this series as a whole, if you're struggling with anxiety or brain fog or ADD or trouble concentrating or depression, and you're ready to finally start a personalized plan and find answers, if you suspect that you have SIBO or if you have it and you're looking for more guidance, let us know. I'm going to link to, you can schedule a free 15-minute call with me. It's a free 15-minute discovery call, consultation. We will talk more about the health challenges that you're having, what you're looking for. If it feels like a good fit for both of us at the end of the call, then we'll talk about how to get started. And if not, that's okay too. So hope you take me up on that offer as well. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.